long before the Nok left their silent figures of terracotta in the soil of central Nigeria, long before the whisper of iron rose with the smoke of ancient forges, the land itself spoke in rhythms of wind and rain. It was a place shaped not only by time, but by slow, elemental forces. The Jos Plateau, with its worn, rolling heights, stood at the heart of this world, a raised land ringed by rivers and bush, cradling the beginnings of what would one day be known as the Nok civilization. Here the red laterite earth stretched wide under a sun that gave generously, and sometimes too harshly. The rains came with the monsoon winds, drenching the earth, coaxing life from it. Then the dry season followed, when Harmattan winds swept south from the Sahara, dusting the land with a veil of fine sand. This place, fertile but demanding, offered both bounty and challenge. It was not an idle land. Those who lived upon it had to listen to its moods, had to move with its seasons. And so, long before Nok became Nok, people lived here. People whose names are lost, but whose traces remain, in broken tools, in charcoal, in fragments of pottery crushed by centuries of soil. The land was not empty. The evidence suggests that by 3000 BC, perhaps earlier, hunter-gatherers had already begun to settle in small communities across the region. They understood fire, stone, and the rhythms of wild growth. Over generations, they began to shape the land more deliberately, clearing ground for millet and sorghum, coaxing food from the earth, learning how to live in one place rather than many. These were the quiet beginnings. There were no cities, no kings, no armies. But there was memory, passed from one half to the next. There were hands, calloused and careful, molding clay, carving tools, planting seeds. And there was the sky, vast and open, a constant witness to the lives below. The plateau connected many paths. To the north lay the edge of the Sahara, once greener, now steadily drying. To the south, the forests thickened, where rain fell in near-constant sheets and the rivers swelled. The Nok lands were a bridge between these worlds, neither desert nor jungle, but something in between. It was here that a new way of life would take root, a way that carried with it the seeds of something enduring. Archaeologists speak of this era in layers of soil, in carbon-dated ash, in the curve of a worn stone. But beneath those measurements lies something deeper, a truth that pulses through every culture. The world does not begin with monuments. It begins with people, gathering, watching the sky, listening to the land. In time, these early communities would grow more skilled. They would settle the uplands and the valleys, building circular compounds with earthen walls, planting millet and tending goats. Their tools would become more refined. Their pots would bear marks, lines, dots, patterns, that spoke not only of function, but of meaning. And one day, out of this quiet rhythm, a culture would rise whose art would astonish those who found it buried in the earth. But all that still lay ahead. For now, the land was preparing them, testing their resolve, shaping their skills. The land was teaching them how to endure, how to adapt, and how to leave behind more than footprints. Thus begins the story of the Nok, not with kings, not with conquests, but with soil, with seed, and with silence. Before the Nok emerged in full, their world was shared with others, older peoples, older paths. The land had been walked upon for millennia, long before any sculptor shaped clay or any smith struck iron. The echoes of those earlier footsteps still lingered in the soil, quiet but unforgotten. Archaeological traces across West Africa point to a slow, gradual shift, a movement from scattered bands of foragers toward more rooted communities. It was not a revolution, but a rhythm. The hunter-gatherers of the region, perhaps descendants of the early Holocene peoples, began to live in more settled groups, following the pulse of seasonal rains and the patterns of wild grains. By the 3rd millennium BC, these groups had learned to cultivate the land, not in the sweeping fields of later empires, but in garden plots, nestled close to their dwellings. They grew pearl millet, hardy and well-suited to the alternating wet and dry of the savanna. They may have domesticated cowpeas, gathered wild yams, and tended small flocks of goats. From the forests came fruits and medicinal herbs, from the rivers, fish and turtles. These were the early stewards of the land, the ancestors not in blood but in spirit to the Nok. Though their names are gone, their habits, patient cultivation, the shaping of pottery, the rhythm of seasonal migrations, would pass down into the heart of the Nok world. And with them came stories, oral traditions carried in songs, in rituals, in the naming of hills and waters. Though we cannot hear their words, we can imagine the cadence, tales of spirits dwelling in trees, of ancestors watching from beyond the firelight, of lessons bound to the earth itself. In these early tales, the world was alive. Every rock, every river, every sudden gust of wind had meaning. One of the most profound shifts of this time was not in what people made, but in how they saw themselves. As their roots deepened, so did their sense of place. Their settlements, small clusters of huts arranged in loose circles, became more than shelter, they became homes. Hearths were passed from generation to generation. Burial grounds grew around the edges of living spaces, reminders that the dead remained near, guiding, remembering. And then, slowly, something new began to stir in this land. Around 1500 BC, perhaps earlier, patterns in the archaeological record began to change. The pottery grew more distinct, more refined. The designs, incised lines, geometric motifs, deliberate forms, hinted at a shared vision. Tools became more standardized, more specialized. And in time, the first terracotta figures emerged from the clay. These were not the scattered artifacts of a wandering people. They were the signs of something cohesive, something cultural. A shift was taking place, not only in technology, but in thought, in the very way people understood their world and their place within it. The Nok would inherit this foundation. But they would also transcend it. They would take the humble practices of these early peoples and lift them into something grander, something enduring. Yet even as Nok culture rose, it did not begin from nothing. It grew from the roots of those who came before, anonymous, quiet, but essential. And so, before the name Nok was ever spoken, the land was already alive with stories, with labor, with hope. The past was already deep, and the future, still unknown, was drawing near. Somewhere between the 13th and 10th centuries before the Common Era, a quiet transformation began to unfold on the Jos Plateau and its surrounding lands. It did not announce itself with grand monuments or sweeping conquests. Instead, It rose from the earth itself, shaped in clay, fired in smoke, and carried in the rhythms of everyday life. This was the beginning of the Nok culture. Its name, as we know it today, comes not from the people themselves, but from a small village where fragments of their world were unearthed centuries later, Nok, in present-day Kaduna State. There, in the 1920s, miners digging for tin stumbled upon strange, weathered figures beneath the soil, heads with wide, oval eyes, flared nostrils, intricate hairstyles, and expressions that seemed to carry thought and memory. They were ancient. They were powerful. And they were only the beginning. From that moment forward, archaeologists began to piece together the story of a culture that had left no written word, but whose legacy lay in terracotta and iron, in pottery shards and hearthstones. Radiocarbon dating placed the earliest Nok presence as far back as 1500 BC, perhaps even earlier, making it among the oldest known complex societies in sub-Saharan Africa. But what was Nok, truly? It was not a kingdom in the traditional sense. There were no palaces, no known kings, no armies carved into stone. Nok seems instead to have been a culture, a shared way of life that extended across a broad region of central Nigeria, linked more by custom and craft than by centralized power. Its people lived in small, scattered settlements, often near streams or on gently rising hills. They built with what the land offered: mud, wood, thatch. Their homes were round, their compounds communal. Daily life followed the patterns of the seasons, planting millet and cowpeas, tending goats, harvesting fruits, collecting clay. But there was more than subsistence here. There was imagination. From the earliest layers of Nok settlements, archaeologists began to uncover a consistent, deliberate style of pottery, decorated with incised patterns, concentric circles, and geometric lines. The shapes were not merely utilitarian, they were expressive. The same hands that shaped bowls also shaped images of people, of animals, of something deeper. Terracotta figures, hollow and carefully modeled, began to appear in abundance. Why they were made remains uncertain. Some suggest they served as ancestors, others that they were guardians or offerings. Perhaps they were all of these things at once. What is clear is that they mattered. They were not the work of idle hands. They were ritual, memory, belief made visible. And beneath this artistry ran another current: iron. Nok is one of the earliest known cultures in West Africa to smelt iron. It did not come gradually, as in other regions. Here, the people seemed to leap from stone tools directly into iron, bypassing bronze altogether. The forges that dotted the hills of Taruga and elsewhere were not mere experiments. They were skilled, deliberate, and sophisticated. In these two threads, art and metallurgy, the Nok revealed their identity. They were not a people of conquest, but of craft. They did not build empires, but they shaped beauty and bent metal to their will. In a world still thought primitive by outsiders, Nok stood as proof of complexity, creativity, and civilization. And yet, they remain, in many ways, a mystery. Their language is lost. Their names are unknown. No written chronicles tell their tale. But they left us their hands in clay. Their silence, shaped and fired, still speaks. Life in the Nok world was woven into the earth itself, simple in form, but rich in rhythm. The people did not dwell in cities, nor behind stone walls, but in scattered settlements spread across the open highlands and river valleys of central Nigeria. These were places of quiet endurance, where community grew close to the land. The typical Nok settlement sat atop a gentle rise or near a seasonal stream. The terrain was practical, defensible, fertile, and close to clay-rich soil and iron-bearing stones. From this landscape came their materials, and from their labor, homes were formed. They built in round forms, following an ancient architectural memory, structures of mud and thatch, each one centered around the hearth. The village was a circle within a circle, with people at its heart and the natural world pressing always at its edge. Paths crisscrossed the settlements like veins, connecting dwelling to dwelling, garden to kill, forge to field. Each home stood with quiet dignity, part of a whole, not imposing but enduring. The compound, often shared by extended families, was the nucleus of Nok life. There, generations lived together, worked together, and remembered together. Within these clusters, daily life unfolded with purpose. The land was cultivated with patience. Pearl millet grew in tight, waving rows. Cowpeas, drought-resistant and nourishing, filled out the gaps. The soil was tilled with iron hoes, precious tools born of flame and skill. Children gathered firewood, women fetched water, and men shaped earth and stone. Yet the boundaries of labor were not strict. Women molded pots, kneaded clay, and likely tended to spiritual rites. Men may have taken part in the creation of terracotta forms, or in the smelting of iron deep in the forest, where the heat and danger required secrecy and care. Animals roamed nearby, goats and sheep, perhaps chickens. They were not merely food, but symbols of value, woven into ritual and kinship exchange. And beyond the fields, the wild still thrived. Nok life was never far from nature. The bush held medicine, mystery, and memory. It was both danger and sanctuary. Trade, too, moved through the settlements, not in caravans, but in slow, steady exchange. From other villages came beads, perhaps crafted from stone or shell. Iron tools traveled from smelting sites to farms. Clay figures moved from hand to shrine. These were not the grand markets of later empires, but humble networks of connection, life sustained by familiarity and trust. Though no temples or palaces have been uncovered, the spiritual life of Nok was not absent. It lived in gesture, in art, in the places where form met meaning. The terracotta figures, often found near dwellings, may have stood watch over the living, reminders of ancestors or intermediaries between seen and unseen. There is something timeless in this way of life, rooted, steady, attentive. It was not without hardship. The seasons could be cruel. Crops could fail. Illness came without warning. But within these small, rounded homes, families endured. They laughed. They argued. They mourned. And they shaped their world with hand and heart. In the stillness of the Jos Plateau, Nok life moved slowly, but not without depth. Each settlement, no matter how small, was part of something larger, a culture not of rulers and scribes, but of memory and craft. Here, among the clay and the millet, the Nok way of life found its enduring shape. To live in the Nok world was to live in tune with the earth, a balance of cultivation, craft, and community. Each day unfolded not in haste, but in measured tasks, familiar gestures passed down from mother to daughter, from father to son. The Nok people were farmers, first and foremost. Their survival depended upon the soil, and they knew it well. When the rains came, gentle at first, then fierce, they planted. The crop of choice was pearl millet, a hardy grain that thrived in the open savanna, its long stalks rustling under the breeze. Beside it grew cowpeas, filling the soil with nitrogen and the table with nourishment. These were not luxury crops, but staples, sufficient, sustaining, enduring. Fields were modest, lightly cleared with iron hose and tended by hand. There were no plows, no beasts of burden to till the ground. Only the strength of backs, the sharpness of tools, and the rhythm of the seasons. Children learned early to scatter seed, to weed rows, to chase birds from ripening grain. Food was prepared close to the hearth. Women ground millet on stone querns, the sound of grinding echoing through the morning air. The grains were boiled or pounded, shaped into porridge, perhaps mixed with beans or wild greens. For meat, they kept small livestock, goats, perhaps fowl, and hunted when needed. The nearby bush offered bushmeat, antelope, guinea fowl, and smaller game. But the forest gave more than meat. It offered medicine. Nok families knew the uses of bark and root, of leaf and berry. They gathered wild fruits, shay, baobab, locust bean, and processed them with care. These traditions were not written, but lived, held in memory, preserved by practice. Water, drawn from streams or hand-dug wells, was carried home in pottery jars. The vessels, simple yet often decorated, spoke not only of need, but of beauty. Even the utilitarian bore the mark of the maker's hand. Clothing, though not preserved in the archaeological record, was likely made from bark fiber or woven grasses, dyed and adorned. Hairstyles were intricate, as seen in terracotta heads, braided, coiled, adorned with care. The body itself was a canvas of expression, reflecting identity, age, and perhaps spiritual status. In the evenings, when labor gave way to rest, stories filled the air. Around the fire, elders spoke of ancestors and spirits, of animals who spoke and skies that changed. Music, drums, clapping, the voice, brought rhythm to memory, and laughter to the night. In these moments, the community was not merely surviving, it was living, fully present. And always, the clay. It was gathered from riverbanks, kneaded, shaped, and fired in open kilns. Some of it became vessels, others, figures. These were not mere ornaments. They watched, they listened. Placed at thresholds, at burial grounds, or beneath the eaves, they connected the living to something deeper. Life in the Nok world was not grand, but it was whole. Every task had purpose. Every gesture, tradition. In the absence of writing, it was daily life itself that carried memory. And though the Nok left no monuments, their presence remains, in the rhythm of hands that shaped the land, and in the quiet beauty of the world they made. Before the heat of furnaces brought iron into their hands, the Nok people shaped their world with stone. It is easy to overlook these quieter tools, so plain, so weathered, so unassuming beside the grandeur of terracotta figures. But they were essential. They were the instruments of life. Across Nok sites, archaeologists have uncovered an array of stone tools, grinding stones, pestles, hammer stones, and hand axes. These implements speak of a people intimately familiar with the weight and grain of stone, a people who understood how to chip and shape it, not for glory, but for daily bread. The most common were the grinding stones, flat, worn surfaces paired with rounded pestles. Upon them, grains were crushed and pounded, broken down into meal for cooking. These stones were more than tools, they were part of the household, passed from one generation to the next. Their surfaces, smoothed by countless hours of labor, bear silent witness to 1,000 meals prepared, 1,000 conversations held at dawn and dusk. Hammerstones and flake tools also played their part. Some were used in food preparation, others in crafting, breaking bone, splitting wood, shaping other tools. They were efficient, sometimes elegant in their simplicity. And while iron would later come to dominate, these stone tools did not disappear. They remained, side by side with metal, for they were trusted, known, sufficient for their tasks. Among the more curious finds are stone beads and ornaments, tiny discs and rings, drilled with care, likely strung together as necklaces or waistbands. These were not for utility. They were for identity, for beauty, perhaps even for ceremony. To wear such an item was to declare something about oneself, to belong, to remember, to mark a moment in life. The presence of these crafted stones, especially the ornamental types, suggests a society that understood more than survival. It understood symbolism. It had room for artistry even in the smallest details. The same hands that planted millet and shaped iron also polished stone to a fine sheen, not out of need, but out of choice. In some sites, archaeologists have found polished stone discs, purpose unknown. Were they tools, weights, game pieces? Or did they serve in rituals now lost to time? Their mystery lingers, a quiet reminder that not all of Nok's knowledge can be reclaimed. And so, amid the clay and iron, the Nok stone legacy endures, not grand, not ornate, but enduring. These tools are not the artifacts of a primitive past, but of a people who knew their world well, who worked it with care, and who left behind not only the echo of their labor, but the imprint of their hands. If stone was the Nok people's tool for survival, then pottery was their canvas for expression. Through it, they left behind a language of pattern and form, a quiet, enduring narrative inscribed not with ink, but with fingertips and sticks, shaped in wet earth and sealed with fire. The pottery of Nok is as distinctive as it is abundant. It appears in every layer of their settlements, from the earliest hearths to the final days of their presence. Over time, it changed, slowly, subtly, offering glimpses into the evolution of their society, their aesthetics, and their hands. The earliest Nok pottery, dating as far back as 1500 BC, is simple in form but deliberate in design. Vessels were hand-built, coiled rather than wheel-thrown, and carefully smoothed. Their surfaces bore incised patterns, zigzags, cross-hatching, lines arranged with intention. These were not idle decorations. They were symbols, perhaps markers of clan or family, of use or ritual, of meaning now lost. As time progressed, so did the refinement of their ceramics. By the middle phase of Nok culture, around 1000 to 500 BC, pottery forms grew more diverse. There were deep bowls, wide-mouthed jars, and graceful-necked vessels. The surface treatment became more elaborate. Geometric motifs appeared in greater variety: spirals, chevrons, punctate impressions. The clay was better prepared, tempered with ground stone or organic matter to ensure strength. Firing techniques improved, resulting in more consistent coloration and durability. These pots were not mass-produced. Each one bore the trace of the individual who shaped it: the subtle tilt of a lip, the slight asymmetry of a base, the pressure of a thumb on wet clay. And yet, there was unity. Across the Nok region, certain stylistic elements remained consistent, pointing to a shared tradition, perhaps passed down through apprenticeships or village teachings. By the later phase of Nok culture, around 500 BC to the 1st centuries AD, pottery production remained strong, though some signs suggest a shift. The decoration began to decline in complexity. Forms became more utilitarian. Whether this marked a change in spiritual practices, a move toward pragmatism, or the pressures of societal transition is uncertain. What is known is that even as the great terracotta figures appeared less frequently, the pottery endured, still crafted, still used, still valued. But pottery was more than a household item. It held grain and water, yes, but also oil, meat, offerings. Some pots were used in burial contexts, placed alongside the dead. Others were found in shrines or near the remains of kilns, suggesting a spiritual or ceremonial purpose. Their presence in so many aspects of life, birth, sustenance, death, makes them windows into the soul of the Nok people. In the hands of Nok potters, clay became both tool and text. It spoke of daily life and of deeper belief. It carried the imprint of a culture that found beauty in repetition, meaning in symmetry, and memory in earth. And so, even now, long buried, the pots remain. Cracked and incomplete, perhaps, but still bearing the story of a people who shaped their world not with monuments of stone, but with the simple, sacred touch of clay. To understand the heart of Nok civilization, one must look not to the forges or figures, but to the furrows of their fields. For all their artistry and technological skill, the Nok people were, at their core, agriculturalists, bound to the cycles of planting and harvest, to the slow work of coaxing life from soil. Their agriculture was not grand, but it was sufficient. It required no irrigation canals, no terraced mountainsides, no monumental granaries. Instead, it relied on the patient knowledge of the land, when to sow, when to reap, how to endure the season of want. Pearl millet was their mainstay. It thrived in the open savanna, where rains came in summer and dried quickly under the sun. The grain was hardy, tall, and forgiving. Its cultivation required rhythm, not force. It was broadcast across prepared ground, then lightly worked in. And it returned much for little: stalks for thatch, grain for food, and a cycle that could sustain. Alongside millet, the Nok grew cowpeas, legumes rich in protein, vital in a diet where meat was not always abundant. These beans also nourished the soil, returning nitrogen to the earth, ensuring the fertility of the fields for years to come. Some may have cultivated gourds or okra. Others may have managed wild stands of yams or fruit trees, blending the cultivated and the natural in a way that was uniquely West African. The agricultural system was likely semi-permanent. Fields were cleared and planted for several years, then left fallow, allowed to recover while others were opened. It was a moving pattern, shifting with need, with season, with family growth. Nok farmers did not strip the land bare. They worked with it, adapting rather than dominating. Their tools, at first of stone, grew sharper with the arrival of iron. Simple hoes and adzes allowed for deeper tilling, faster clearing, more efficient harvests. Iron, rare though it was, marked a change, a deepening of the agricultural economy. It gave more control, more possibility, more resilience in the face of drought or difficulty. Farming was not a solitary task. It was communal. Extended families worked together, rising with the sun, breaking soil in lines, sharing labor, songs, and rest. The village watched over its fields, and in turn, the fields fed the village. In the off-seasons, when the rain ceased and the ground hardened, the people turned to other tasks, repairing homes, crafting pottery, perhaps making figures. But always, the land waited. And when the rains returned, the fields called again. Food was stored in earthen granaries, raised from the ground to keep pests at bay. Meals were prepared simply, millet porridge, bean stews, perhaps flavored with herbs or oil. Occasionally, meat or fowl might be added, or fish from nearby streams. But mostly, sustenance came from what was sown and tended. This was a life not of wealth, but of balance. The Nok were not driven by conquest or expansion, but by continuity. Their agriculture was enough. It anchored them, generation after generation. It gave them time to create, to remember, to shape a culture whose echoes still linger. And so, among the stones and sculptures, we must not forget the soil. For in every seed they planted, the Nok affirmed their place in the world. In every harvest, they honored the pact between people and earth. Among all the relics left behind by the Nok, none speak louder than their terracotta sculptures. Found buried beneath centuries of soil, these figures emerge not as fragments of broken things, but as full expressions of thought, of belief, of identity. They are the Nok's voice across time, silent, yet eloquent. The earliest of these sculptures likely appeared not long after 1000 BC, perhaps even earlier. Their discovery in sites like Nok, Taruga, and Katsinyala revealed something unexpected, a level of artistic skill and conceptual depth unmatched by any known culture of sub-Saharan Africa in that era. They were sculpted from the same clay used to make pots and vessels, but they were never meant for daily use. These were not utilitarian objects. They were symbolic, deliberate, and sacred. The forms they took were varied, men and women, seated and standing, adorned and plain. Some wore elaborate hairstyles, high and intricate, echoing what may have been real-life fashions. Others bore jewelry, armlets, or collars, suggesting social roles or ceremonial functions. Faces were stylized, yet expressive, eyes often large and almond-shaped, mouths small and pursed, noses flared and strong. There was an elegance in the geometry, a rhythm in the features. And yet, these were not portraits. They were not likenesses of individuals, but types, roles, perhaps spirits or ancestors. Some figures had animal attributes, flared ears, elongated limbs, or even full animal forms. These may have represented totems, symbols of power, or metaphors for qualities admired or feared. The technique was meticulous. Knock sculptors built their figures hollow, coil by coil, then carved and smoothed the surface. They added detail with combs, picks, and fingers, pressing patterns into the wet clay, scoring lines to define hair, clothing, or scarification. Many figures stood over 1/2 meter tall. Some, though now broken, may have been even larger. Their fragility ensured that few survived whole. Most were found shattered, their limbs and torsos scattered by time, erosion, and the roots of trees. But even in fragments, their presence is unmistakable. They possess a serenity, a quiet power. They do not demand attention, they invite contemplation. Why were they made? This remains one of the Knock's greatest mysteries. The figures are rarely found in tombs, and few have been discovered in clear ritual contexts. Some scholars believe they were part of household altars, others that they marked sacred spaces or burial grounds. Perhaps they were offerings to the ancestors, or to spirits that guided the rains, the harvest, the forge. Perhaps they were protectors, storytellers, symbols of status, or all of these at once. What is clear is that they were more than decoration. They were embodiments of meaning. In a world without writing, the Knock chose to speak through clay. They shaped their beliefs into form, their hopes into posture, their identity into the curve of a jaw or the tilt of a head. These sculptures were not only beautiful, they were alive with intention. And though the people who made them are gone, though their names are forgotten, the figures remain, eyes wide open, watching still. To fully grasp the power of Knock terracottas, one must see them not as isolated works of art, but as part of a lived environment, a spiritual and social world in which these figures held meaning, presence, and perhaps even authority. They were not placed in museums or locked away in shrines. They were part of everyday sacred life, woven into the rhythm of villages, fields, and seasons. Though found most often broken and dispersed, their repeated appearance across so many sites, over 100 scattered throughout central Nigeria, speaks of a widespread and shared tradition. This was not the practice of a single community. It was the voice of a culture. Some of these sculptures were discovered in or near what may have been household compounds. Their positioning suggests a domestic role, guardianship, perhaps, or ancestral presence. Others appear to have been intentionally buried. Whether these burials marked transitions, rites, or offerings remains uncertain. But the placement was not random. It was chosen. It had meaning. Terracottas have also been unearthed in proximity to iron smelting sites. This is a tantalizing clue. It raises the possibility that the figures were connected to metallurgy, not simply in practice, but in ritual. In many African cultures, ironworkers are revered or even feared, seen as mediators between earth and fire, the human and the divine. If knocksmiths held such status, the terracottas may have served as their guardians, their patrons, or their silent witnesses. Their expressions offer no easy interpretation. Some figures appear serene, contemplative. Others seem strained, their faces marked by tension or illness. A few are disfigured, missing limbs, with swollen joints or distorted features. These may have been depictions of physical suffering, or metaphors for moral or spiritual states. In later West African traditions, similar figures are used to convey warning, to embody affliction, or to mark the boundary between worlds. Some scholars have noted that many Nok terracottas appear to be head fragments. Were the heads made separately? Were they broken intentionally as part of ritual closure? Or have time and erosion simply favored the survival of the most durable parts? We do not yet know. What is certain is that these sculptures were not casually made. The effort required, the labor of shaping, the risk of firing, the scarcity of suitable clay, points to a deep cultural investment. They were not toys, nor idols in the sense imposed by later lenses. They were something closer to companions, embodiments, reminders of things not spoken. In their silence, they carried memory. Perhaps of ancestors. Perhaps of myth. Perhaps of collective truths known only to the Nok themselves. Today, removed from their context, they sit behind glass. They are studied, admired, sometimes misunderstood. But in their time, they stood under open sky, surrounded by militant music, fire, and wind. They were not artifacts. They were present, part of the community, part of the story, part of the sacred dance between earth and life. As Nok terracottas multiplied across the landscape, another truth began to emerge, one less visible than formal motif, but no less important. Behind each figure was a maker. And behind the maker, a system. These sculptures were not the result of isolated inspiration, but of practiced hands, organized labor, and cultural intention. The Nok were not merely artisans. They were specialists. The size of many terracotta pieces is striking. Some figures stand over half a meter tall, too large, too intricate to be casually made. They required not only skill, but time, materials, and cooperation. The clay had to be sourced, cleaned, tempered. The sculpture built, coil by coil, with walls of even thickness to survive the fire. The details, eyes, jewelry, hair, had to be applied with care. And then, the firing itself, open air, perhaps in pit kilns, where heat was hard to control, and failure was always a risk. This process was not simple. Nor was it solitary. Across different Nok sites, there is a striking consistency in sculptural style. The proportions, the facial features, the decorations, though varied, fall within a recognizable aesthetic tradition. This suggests a shared training, a visual language taught and maintained over generations. Perhaps there were workshops. Perhaps there were master sculptors whose knowledge was passed from teacher to apprentice. What is clear is that these figures were the product of a culture that valued artistic precision and symbolic continuity. Chemical analysis of the clay adds another layer. Studies have shown that many terracottas, even those found miles apart, were made from similar materials. This implies either shared clay sources or the movement of finished sculptures across regions. In either case, it suggests a network of artisans, of trade, of shared values. And it did not end with sculpture. Pottery shows similar evidence of standardization. The forms and decorations, while not identical, echo each other. So too with iron tools. The evidence points to emerging specialization, individuals or families focused on particular crafts, supported by an agricultural base that allowed some to step away from the field and toward the kiln, the forge, or the workshop. This is a hallmark of complex society, not monumental architecture, not conquest, but the emergence of roles, of professions, of sustained skill. The Nok, though lacking in written record or royal lineage, were nonetheless organized. They built a culture where beauty was not a luxury, but a practice. Where craft was not scattered, but cultivated. One must imagine a Nok village not as a collection of identical tasks, but as a web of talents. Here, a woman shaping pots. There, a man tending a bloomery furnace. Nearby, a sculptor smoothing the brow of a figure. Each role fed the others. Each role was needed. And through this structure, the culture endured. Ideas were preserved not in scrolls, but in form. Identity was carried not by title, but by craft. In their sculptures, the Nok left more than art. They left evidence of a society that had moved beyond survival, into expression, into mastery, into memory. Though silent and still today, many Nok sculptures seem to breathe with the memory of motion. Their poses, sometimes subtle, sometimes striking, suggest that these figures were never meant to be passive. They were watchers, dancers, warriors, or spirits in mid-gesture. Through their form, the Nok gave movement to memory. Some of the most striking figures appear seated, with knees drawn or crossed in ceremonial fashion. Others are poised on one knee, heads turned as if listening or observing something just beyond reach. The curvature of spines, the tension in limbs, the careful tilt of heads, these are the signs of sculptors not merely capturing anatomy, but conveying energy. The Nok understood how to suggest life in stillness. Hands are often emphasized. Open palms, grasping fists, fingers pointing toward unseen symbols, these gestures may have carried meaning. Perhaps they were part of dance, ritual, or communication. Perhaps they were the movements of prayer, protection, or performance. Whatever their purpose, they reveal a sensitivity to the human body as both vessel and voice. Some terracottas depict figures in dynamic motion, riding animals, holding tools, or seemingly caught mid-step. One remarkable fragment shows what may be a figure paddling a canoe, suggesting that rivers were not only practical routes, but symbols of passage, of transition, even of ceremony. Boats appear again and again in West African traditions, as carriers of the soul, as links between villages, as pathways between the worlds of the living and the dead. The presence of such movement also hints at broader themes in Nok life. This was not a sedentary culture in spirit, even if their villages were rooted in place. People moved, along rivers, across hills, from one settlement to the next. Ideas moved, too, carried in clay, in metal, in song. And with them moved beliefs, rituals, memories. Animal figures, too, appear in various states of motion, often not naturalistic, but suggestive. Elephants, monkeys, birds, some abstracted, others more detailed, may have embodied traits admired or feared. A bird in flight, an antelope mid-leap, these were not mere depictions, but signs. In movement, the Nok may have seen spirit. And yet, this understanding of motion was not chaotic. It was balanced, measured. The figures, though animated, remain composed. They are never frantic. Their movement is deliberate, like the movement of dance, or ritual, or a remembered story told with the body. In a world without writing, such gestures became text. A tilted head could suggest reverence. A raised arm, power. A seated posture, wisdom. These were not random. They were inherited, taught, repeated across generations of hands and eyes. Today, as we look upon these fragments, torsos without arms, legs without bodies, heads with eyes still wide, we see not what was broken, but what once moved. And in that movement, the Nok remain alive. They walk still, across time. Somewhere in the deep rhythm of Nok life, a life of farming, crafting, and shaping clay, a new material began to rise from the earth, dark and heavy, born of fire and transformation. It was iron. And with its arrival, Nok society entered a new era, quietly, without fanfare, but with consequences that would echo through generations. What makes the Nok's embrace of iron so remarkable is not merely that it occurred, but how it did. In most parts of the ancient world, metallurgy followed a known path, from copper to bronze, and only later to iron. But in West Africa, the Bronze Age never came. The Nok leapt directly from stone to iron, a transition as profound as it was mysterious. By around 1000 BC, perhaps earlier, evidence of iron smelting begins to appear across the Nok region. The site of Taruga, in particular, offers clear proof. There, archaeologists unearthed the remains of furnaces, tuyers, clay pipes for injecting air, slag, the byproduct of smelting, and fragments of iron tools. These were not crude experiments. They were part of an established process, technical, skilled, and repeatable. The knowledge required to smelt iron was immense. It demanded not only the discovery of iron-bearing ore, but the understanding of how to extract metal from stone using only charcoal and wind. Temperatures had to reach over 1100 degrees Celsius, achievable only with careful control and design. The furnaces themselves had to be built from clay that could withstand intense heat, and the workers had to know when to feed, when to fan, and when to break the furnace to retrieve the bloom of iron within. Such knowledge was not stumbled upon. It was taught. It was earned. It was guarded. Iron changed everything. It made tools more efficient, stronger, more durable. Farmers could now clear fields more easily, dig more deeply, harvest more quickly. Hunters could craft better weapons. Builders could shape wood with greater ease. Life became not easier, but more capable. And yet, iron was never common. It was labor-intensive to produce, and the ore was often of variable quality. A single tool carried immense value. It was a possession of status, perhaps even of ritual significance. In some societies, blacksmiths were set apart, respected, even feared, for their power to tame fire and shape earth. Whether knocksmiths held such status is not fully known, but the evidence suggests they were not ordinary laborers. Their work required knowledge of the hidden, of flame, of stone, of transformation. In later African traditions, these are often the domains of those who walk between worlds. The Nok did not leave us writings to explain their iron. But their legacy is clear. They were among the earliest in West Africa to master this technology. And they did so not by imitation, but by innovation, independently, perhaps uniquely. The transition to iron did not sweep away what came before. Stone tools remained. Clay figures continued to be made. But beneath the surface, a shift had occurred. The Nok had entered an age not only of art, but of metallurgy, of mastery over matter itself. And in doing so, they laid a foundation. For long after their names were forgotten, the iron they forged would continue to shape the world they left behind. To trace the footsteps of Nok metallurgy is to journey into the village of Teruga, an unassuming rise of earth in central Nigeria that holds within it the breath of ancient furnaces, the echo of hammer on anvil, and the smoke of fires long cooled. Teruga is not a myth. It is one of the few Nok sites where the evidence of iron smelting is unmistakable, lead in earth and ash, preserved by the very materials it once transformed. Excavated by Bernard Fagg in the mid-20th century, Teruga revealed what many had suspected: the Nok were not only artists, they were early masters of metal. Here, scattered across the site, were the remains of furnaces. These were not large by modern standards, but they were efficient. Constructed from clay, cylindrical in form, and open at the top, they used natural draft and sometimes bellows to fan the heat. The key component was the tuyere, a clay pipe inserted at the base, allowing air to enter and flames to rise. Through these pipes, controlled bursts of wind fed the fire, raising the temperature high enough to smelt iron ore. Near these furnaces lay slag, heavy, black, glassy waste, the byproduct of iron production. Its presence was abundant, clustered near the furnace bases, suggesting regular, repeated smelting activity. There were also fragments of the iron itself, rudimentary tools, broken blooms, and iron bits that once may have been hoes, knives, or spear tips. What makes Teruga truly significant is not just its metallurgical remains, but the company they kept. Scattered around the smelting areas were terracotta fragments, pieces of heads, limbs, torsos. These were not dumped as refuse. Their placement suggests they may have been part of the smelting environment itself, perhaps as spiritual guardians, perhaps as offerings, perhaps as symbols of the transformation that the fire embodied. This overlap between clay and iron, art and industry, is one of the defining features of Nok culture. It suggests a world view in which the practical and the sacred were not separate. To smelt iron was not merely to shape tools, it was to engage with forces greater than oneself. Fire was not just a means, it was a mystery. Taruga offers us a rare clarity. In most Nok sites, the passage of time has scattered the clues. But here, they remain layered: pottery, figures, iron, slag. Together, they tell a story, not of a single event, but of a sustained practice. Taruga was not a place of chance discovery. It was a center of knowledge, of labor, of sacred fire. We do not know the names of those who worked here. We do not know their songs, their prayers, their fears as the flames rose and the ore began to glow. But we know their hands were skilled. We know their work endured. And as we walk among the remnants of their kilns, the ash beneath our feet still murmurs of a time when earth was broken, clay was shaped, and metal was born from stone. To transform raw stone into iron is not a simple act of fire, it is a discipline, a process steeped in observation, precision, and tradition. In the Nok world, this process was practiced with care, and though the full story of their metallurgy remains veiled by time, what we do know reveals a society that did more than experiment, it mastered. The Nok smelting process began with ore. Iron-rich stones, often hematite or magnetite, were gathered from the earth, likely from surface deposits near hills and riverbeds. These stones, dull and unremarkable to an untrained eye, held within them the potential for transformation. The Nok knew how to find them, how to test them, and how to prepare them. The ore was crushed, by hand, with stones, and then mixed with charcoal, the fuel of the furnace. Charcoal was not simply burned wood, it was wood carefully reduced in low-oxygen fires, producing dense, carbon-rich fuel capable of sustaining high temperatures. Trees, then, were as vital to metallurgy as ore itself. And forests were not merely for hunting or gathering, they were part of the forge ecosystem. The furnaces, as seen at sites like Taruga, were modest in size, typically no more than a meter tall. They were built from clay and shaped into shafts, with tuyers inserted low along the sides. Through these tuyers, air was blown, either by bellows or by exploiting natural drafts, depending on the furnace's design. The goal was simple, yet difficult, to raise the temperature above 1,100 degrees Celsius, hot enough to separate iron from its ore. This was no small feat. The smelting process had to be maintained for hours, carefully fed, watched, and managed. Too little air, and the furnace would cool; too much, and it would collapse. The balance was delicate. The iron, once smelted, did not flow like liquid metal. It emerged as a bloom, a spongy mass of iron mixed with slag. This bloom had to be removed, reheated, and worked, hammered, folded, and purified until it became usable. It is likely that this secondary step, the forging, occurred near the smelting sites, using stone or iron hammers upon anvils of rock. The result was raw tools, hoes, knives, perhaps spearheads. These were simple but effective. Iron, once shaped, was stronger than stone and far more durable. What is particularly striking is the sophistication of this process, and the evidence that it was not a one-time discovery, but a maintained tradition. The presence of standardized furnace parts, reused 2 years, and consistent slag patterns suggests that smelting was done regularly and with understanding. This was not magic. It was knowledge. And knowledge implies teachers. It implies specialists, those who did not merely stumble upon the process, but who passed it on, refined it, and guarded its secrets. In many African societies, the smith was a figure of mystery and respect, a maker of tools, yes, but also a wielder of transformation, someone who touched the edge of the sacred. Whether the Nok saw their smiths this way, we cannot say. But the care they gave to the process, the presence of terracottas near furnaces, and the depth of their technical skill all point to a people who saw in iron not just utility, but meaning. From crushed stone and burned wood, they drew strength. And in the quiet hum of their furnaces, they reshaped the land and themselves. Once drawn from the furnace and hammered into form, iron entered the rhythm of Nok life, not as ornament, but as a companion to labor. It did not dazzle. It served. In the fields, iron hoes and adzes changed the pace of agriculture. Where stone tools required frequent sharpening and broke with ease, iron was reliable. With it, a farmer could break hardened earth more quickly, dig deeper furrows, and turn over wider plots of land. In a world where the rains arrived in narrow windows, such efficiency mattered. Time saved was food gained. Hunting, too, was reshaped. Iron-tipped spears and arrowheads pierced more cleanly, traveled farther, and could be crafted in finer shapes than those of stone or bone. In a land where bushmeat supplemented grain, this was no small advantage. It meant better yields, safer hunts, and perhaps even new tactics. Even within the village, iron found its place. Knives for cutting, scrapers for hides, blades for shaping wood, these were not luxuries. They were necessities. Every household would have desired one, though not every household could afford it. Iron was rare. The smelting process was laborious, and ore was not limitless. As a result, iron tools may have been objects of exchange, passed between families, gifted in ceremonies, or inherited across generations. This scarcity gave iron weight, not only in heft, but in meaning. A tool made of iron was a mark of status, of wealth in the old sense, not of silver or coin, but of usefulness, connection, and permanence. And it is here, perhaps, that we glimpse the beginnings of social differentiation. Not in palaces or thrones, but in the quiet accumulation of capacity. A family with iron could plant more. A hunter with an iron tip could feed more. A craftsman with iron tools could shape better wares. And a smith, able to make such things, would have carried both respect and caution in equal measure. The link between metallurgy and social structure is subtle, but real. As iron spread, so too did the possibility of specialized roles, those who farmed, those who forged, those who traded between them. Nok society, though not yet urban, was growing in complexity. And iron was part of that growth. It did not erase the old ways. Stone tools continued to be used, side by side with iron. They were familiar, easy to make, and adequate for many tasks. But iron marked a step, a turning point in how the Nok engaged with their environment. And perhaps it changed not only what they could do, but how they thought. For iron was not only hard and sharp, it was born of fire, hidden in rock, and brought forth by human will. To wield it was to participate in something profound, the power to transform nature itself. In this quiet revolution, Knock life moved forward, not loudly, not suddenly, but with the slow, sure weight of a blade drawn from the earth. Among the many footprints left by the Knock people, the discoveries at Samandukia stand apart, both for their richness and for the light they cast on the complexity of Knock life. Nestled within the vast stretch of central Nigeria, this site revealed not only fragments of everyday existence, but echoes of something deeper, ritual, refinement, perhaps even remembrance. Unearthed in the mid-20th century, Samandukia yielded a wide array of artifacts, terracotta figures, pottery, iron objects, and signs of organized activity. But more than their variety, it was their arrangement that stirred curiosity. These were not random scatterings of village life. They appeared curated, placed, even consecrated. The terracotta fragments, many broken, yet still expressive, were found alongside smelting debris, slag, furnace remnants, and 2 years. This proximity echoes what was seen at Taruga, suggesting once again that art and metallurgy were not separate domains. They coexisted, perhaps even cooperated, in a shared spiritual or ceremonial space. Several figures at Samandukia show distinct variations in style, less symmetrical, more abstract, sometimes exaggerated in feature or proportion. Whether these differences reflect regional variation, temporal change, or differing functions is not yet clear. But they remind us that Knock art was not monolithic. It evolved, adapted, and responded to local needs. Iron objects were also found, tools, most likely, though corroded by time. These remnants reaffirm the presence of metalworking knowledge at the site, and the interwoven role of iron in daily and ceremonial life. Among the most intriguing finds were pottery pieces, some richly decorated, others plain, their forms ranging from deep jars to shallow bowls. As at other Knock sites, the pottery bore marks of careful construction and visual intent, incised lines, punctate patterns, and smoothed rims. The variety of styles within a single site suggests either cultural diversity or a long duration of use. Perhaps Samandukia was a place of gathering, of seasonal meetings, of rituals, of shared work. What lingers most is a sense of placement. These artifacts were not discarded. They were arranged. Some appeared buried deliberately, placed in pits or niches. Others were broken, not by time, but by force, as if part of a ritual conclusion. This pattern hints at ceremonial behavior, acts of dedication, closure, or offering. In this way, Samandukia speaks not only to the hands of the Knock, but to their minds, to their ways of remembering, marking, and honoring. The site may have been a sacred space, a center of metallurgy and meaning, a place where earth was shaped into tools and symbols alike. Though we cannot know the names they gave it, or the songs they sang there, we can stand in its echo. And in the soil of Samandukia, we see a people who worked with care, who believed with depth, and who left behind not chaos, but a quiet order, measured in clay, in iron, and in time. As Knock society flourished between 1500 and 500 BC, its presence extended beyond the hills and valleys where it began. The terracottas, the iron tools, the pottery, all found far from their places of origin, suggest a culture that did not remain still. The Nok spread, not as an empire, but as an idea, a tradition, a rhythm that moved through the land. Evidence of Nok influence reaches deep into the central Nigerian plateau and beyond, touching regions many days' walk from the heartlands around Nok village and Taruga. At each site, Saman Dukia, Katsini-Ala, and others, one finds echoes of the same aesthetic, the same stylized faces, the same careful pottery, the same iron slag and smelting debris. These are not copies. They are continuations. Threads of a shared cultural fabric. This spread was likely gradual, organic. No armies marched. No cities were raised in dominance. Instead, communities may have grown outward, settling new lands as populations expanded or as resources shifted. Families moved. Traders carried goods. Ideas traveled with them. Trade, though modest in scope, played its part. Nok pottery has been found alongside beads made of stone or shell, items not native to the immediate region. Iron tools, scarce and valuable, were surely traded across communities, linking distant villages through need and craftsmanship. Clay figures may have served as tokens, offerings, or even items of exchange, carried from one village to another, each bearing the familiar marks of Nok tradition. As the culture spread, it may have absorbed new influences or inspired neighboring groups. Over time, the boundaries between Nok and not Nok became porous. Styles blended. Practices shifted. In this way, the influence of Nok became not fixed, but fluid, part of a wider West African current that would eventually give rise to new cultures, new centers of art and metallurgy. There are hints, though still debated, that elements of Nok visual language may have echoed into later traditions. The refined naturalism of Ife sculpture, the ritual use of figures in Igbo Ukwu, the symbolic strength of bronze in Benin, all show parallels, though separated by centuries. These cultures were not descendants in the direct sense, but perhaps inheritors of an aesthetic seed first planted by the Nok. Equally, Nok ironworking may have lit the first fires in a long line of metallurgical knowledge that would carry across the Sahel and into the forests of the south. As later African civilizations rose, armed with iron, adorned with sculpture, grounded in community, they walked, in some quiet way, on paths first laid by Nok hands. And yet, for all this reach, Nok influence did not harden into empire. It remained flexible, absorbed into the landscape, passed along through craft, kinship, and memory. It did not impose, it inspired. In the story of ancient Africa, the Nok are not a forgotten chapter. They are a beginning. In a world without temples or written creeds, the Nok people still carried belief, deeply, quietly, and with reverence. Their rituals left no scriptures, no grand altars, but they left something just as enduring: terracotta figures, carefully shaped and deliberately placed, silent vessels of the spiritual world. Spiritual life for the Nok was likely inseparable from the cycles of nature and community. The earth was not inert, it was alive, breathing with spirit. Trees, rivers, rocks, and animals may have carried meaning far beyond their physical form. In many later West African traditions, which may echo these ancient beliefs, the divine was not distant but present, woven into the fabric of the land itself. It is likely that the Nok saw their world in similar terms. Their terracotta figures reflect this vision. Many appear to be more than representations of people or animals. Their expressions are solemn, their poses deliberate. They sit or kneel, eyes wide, hands poised in gestures of offering or introspection. These were not decorative objects. They were created to serve a purpose likely tied to ritual, memory, or protection. Some of the figures bear signs of disease or injury, swollen joints, misshapen limbs, or expressions of pain. These may have symbolized spiritual ailments, not just physical ones. In later African traditions, similar figures are used to invoke healing, to transfer illness, or to communicate with ancestors and spirits. It is possible that the Nok, too, used sculpture as a means of addressing suffering, both seen and unseen. Other figures are adorned with ornaments, necklaces, bracelets, and headdresses, suggesting that they may represent not just common people, but revered individuals, spiritual intermediaries, or ancestral figures. Their placement within household compounds or near smelting sites adds to this sense of sacred presence. They may have served as guardians, witnesses to ritual, or embodiments of forces both protective and dangerous. There is no evidence of large-scale religious structures in Nok settlements. Worship, if it may be called that, likely took place in open spaces, around fires, beneath trees, at river banks, or in the quiet corners of homes. Offerings may have included food, drink, or crafted objects. Rituals may have marked births, deaths, harvests, or the forging of iron, each a moment where the visible and invisible touched. Smelting itself, a process both hidden and transformative, may have been deeply ritualized. Fire, and human breath conspired to release metal from stone, a power that would surely have seemed sacred. The presence of terracotta figures near furnaces hints at more than practical placement. It suggests a spiritual dimension to the forge, a recognition that creation often walks hand in hand with mystery. The Nok may not have drawn their gods or named them in stone, but they lived with them, in the land, in the air, in the gaze of sculpted eyes. Their rituals have not survived in text, but they linger in gesture, in form, in the care with which each figure was made. They remind us that belief does not require monuments, only meaning. And that the sacred, for the Nok, was never far. It was in the clay, in the fire, in the breath of the world itself. The passage from life to death among the Nok people, though largely hidden by time, still leaves traces, quiet signs in the soil, subtle clues that hint at how they honored their dead, and how they understood the journey beyond. Unlike some ancient societies, the Nok left no great tombs or mausoleums. No elaborate stone markers remain. But here and there, archaeologists have uncovered human remains, burials nestled within the bounds of domestic life, near dwellings, under thresholds, or at the edge of compounds. The dead were not cast out. They were kept close, folded into the daily rhythm of the living. These burials were typically shallow, the bodies placed in extended or flexed positions. Some were laid on their sides, others on their backs. Grave goods were rare, but not absent. A few burials included pottery vessels, perhaps offerings, perhaps containers for food or drink meant to sustain the departed on their next path. In other cases, fragments of iron tools or ornaments were found nearby, suggesting a recognition of the person's role or status in life. Terracotta figures, too, have been found in proximity to burials, though not always within the grave itself. Some may have stood watch at the head or foot of a grave, silent sentinels guarding the spirit's departure. Others may have been part of larger rituals that accompanied death, used before burial, then broken, left behind, or taken away. In some instances, evidence suggests cremation, ashes and bone fragments interred in pottery urns or scattered within designated areas. If this practice existed widely, it would explain the relative scarcity of complete skeletons. Fire, in this context, was not only a tool of transformation in metalwork, it may also have served as a purifier, a liberator of the soul from the body. Yet not all deaths were equal. As with many ancient cultures, the treatment of the dead may have varied according to age, status, or cause of death. Children, in particular, may have been buried differently, or mourned with separate rituals. Women and men, too, may have been remembered in distinct ways, though the evidence is too limited to say with certainty. What endures, however, is a sense of care. The bodies were not discarded. They were laid to rest with attention, with alignment, with objects, with a sense of presence. Even when grave goods are absent, the positioning of the bones tells a story of people who treated the dead not as refuse, but as kin. And so, though the Nok did not inscribe their beliefs in tomb walls or funerary texts, their practices suggest an understanding of life beyond breath. The presence of ancestors, the closeness of spirits, the ongoing role of the departed in the life of the community, all these may have been woven into their world. In time, the graves were covered. Houses were rebuilt. Crops were planted. Life continued. But beneath the feet of the living, the dead remained, a quiet foundation, remembered not in writing, but in proximity, in clay, in the enduring form of a culture that saw no sharp line between this world and the next. The Nok left behind no palaces, no royal graves, no inscriptions to proclaim the deeds of kings or the commands of rulers. And yet, theirs was not a society without structure. Beneath the surface of clay and iron, there lived a quiet order, an organization rooted not in hierarchy, but in harmony, in function, in the rhythms of village life. Their settlements, modest in size and often spread across the plateau, suggest a decentralized way of living. There were no urban centers, no capitals. Instead, clusters of compounds dotted the landscape, each likely made up of extended families or kin groups. These were communities bound by blood, by memory, by the shared labor of field and fire. Leadership, where it existed, may have been local, elders, lineage heads, or individuals respected for their wisdom or skill. The smith, the potter, the healer, the storyteller, each may have carried influence, not through decree, but through respect earned by mastery and service. Authority was not worn like a crown. It was lived. Gender roles, while not fully understood, likely followed patterns familiar in agrarian societies. Women would have played a central role in agriculture, food preparation, pottery making, and perhaps in ritual. men may have taken on roles in hunting, smelting, and village protection. Yet these roles were not fixed. In crafting, in caregiving, in ceremony, both women and men would have shared space, voice, and presence. The presence of specialized crafts, iron smelting, sculpture, advanced pottery, points to a society where not everyone was required to farm. Some individuals had the time and the trust of their community to focus on making, shaping, and refining. This division of labor, though small in scale, is the root of complex society. It speaks of surplus, of cooperation, of an economy built not on coin but on contribution. Trade, too, must have played a role. Iron tools, pottery, and perhaps food or cloth were likely exchanged between villages. These exchanges were not merely economic, they built ties, alliances, and shared identity. Paths across the savannah were not empty. They were walked, known, remembered. Social status may have existed, but subtly. The presence of ornament on certain terracotta figures, the placement of burials, the quality of tools, all hint at differences in wealth or esteem. Yet there is little to suggest rigid class divisions. The Nok, as far as we know, did not build empires. They built communities. And within these communities, life moved in circles. Birth, marriage, death, initiation, each was marked by gesture, by gathering, by a language of ritual passed down without words. Elders remembered. Children learned. The past was not distant. It lived in the voice, in the hearth, in the sculpted clay passed from one hand to the next. In this way, the Nok show us that civilization need not rise with towers or banners. It can live in the unseen threads that bind people together, in work shared, in stories told, in care given. Their world was one of circles, not pyramids. And in that circle, they lived not above or below one another, but beside. Though the Nok civilization faded long before the rise of empires and courts in West Africa, its spirit endured, quietly, yet unmistakably, in the art of those who came after. The terracotta traditions that began in the highlands of central Nigeria did not vanish. They transformed, traveled, and found new life in other hands, in other times. Centuries after the last Nok figure was buried, new sculptural traditions emerged across the region. Among the most renowned were those of Ife and Benin, kingdoms of extraordinary cultural refinement. Their bronze and terracotta heads, lifelike and expressive, would one day astound the world with their naturalism and beauty. But they did not arise from nothing. Scholars have long noted stylistic echoes between Nok and these later traditions. The attention to proportion, the emphasis on facial detail, the portrayal of ornament and status, all bear the imprint of an older visual language. The Nok figures, with their balanced forms and complex symbolism, may not have been direct ancestors, but they were surely predecessors. They set a precedent that clay could carry memory, identity, and presence. Further east, the Bura culture, flourishing in what is now Niger from around the 3rd to 13th centuries AD, produced terracotta figures with similarly solemn expressions and abstracted forms. These works, too, seem to carry forward the visual grammar first shaped in Nok clay. They mark bodies not with realism, but with reverence, with a sense of spirit over flesh. Even in the forested south, among the Igbo and other groups, traditions of metalwork, body ornament, and ancestral veneration suggest long cultural continuities. The famous bronze artifacts of Igbo Ukwu, though made centuries later, show a sophistication in casting and symbolism that resonates with Nok's own fusion of beauty and belief. But legacy is not only found in style. It is found in the idea that art is not separate from life, that the figure in clay is not mere decoration, but a bearer of meaning. That memory can be shaped by hand. That the past can be held, not only in stories, but in form. The Nok showed that artistic excellence did not require cities or kings. It required intention, practice, and faith in the materials of the earth. This lesson was not forgotten. Across West Africa, the use of terracotta in ancestor shrines, fertility rites, and protective rituals continued long after Nok's decline. The hand that shaped a pot or a figure was still seen as sacred. The kiln remained a place of transformation, not just of clay, but of thought. And so, the Nok did not disappear. Their art, though buried, spoke. And others listened. Today, as museums display the Nok figures behind glass, it is tempting to see them as isolated marvels. But they are not isolated. They are links in a chain that winds through time, through culture, through the living traditions of a continent that has always known how to remember, not just in word, but in form. The Nok may have shaped the first verse, but others continued the song. Beneath the artistry and agriculture of the Nok people ran another thread, one less visible, yet no less vital: exchange. Though they built no cities and left no markets in stone, the Nok were part of a living economy, a network of interactions that tied their villages to one another and to the wider world around them. Trade among Nok communities likely followed the paths worn by feet, rivers, and memory. These were not wide roads, but narrow tracks that threaded through forest and savanna, connecting settlements in a web of exchange. Along these paths moved goods, yes, but also knowledge, stories, and kinship. Iron, rare and labor-intensive to produce, was among the most valued of Nok commodities. Its tools, hoes, knives, spear points, were more than implements, they were assets, passed between hands, perhaps bartered for grain, pottery, or livestock. A village with skilled smelters could supply others, creating relationships of dependence and trust. Pottery, too, moved through these networks. Though made locally, its styles were consistent across distances, suggesting either shared traditions or the spread of wares through trade or marriage. A well-made vessel could travel far, carried as a gift or sold at a gathering. Other items also suggest exchange beyond the immediate region. Beads made of stone or shell, not native to central Nigeria, have been found at Nok sites. Their presence implies long-distance trade, perhaps reaching northward toward the Niger River, or even into the Sahel, where salt and copper moved in ancient caravans. In return, Nok may have offered iron goods, foodstuffs, or terracotta figures, whose beauty and symbolism could hold value far from their place of origin. Livestock, too, may have served as a form of wealth. Goats and sheep, portable and useful, were likely traded among families or used in rituals marking alliances or transitions. Food, especially grains and dried fruits, could be exchanged in times of surplus or scarcity, knitting communities together through generosity and need. But trade was not only material. It was social. Marriages linked villages. Ceremonies drew distant kin. A sculptor's style might influence another a day's walk away. A story told at a gathering might find new voice across the hills by moonrise. In this way, the Nok economy was not transactional, but relational. Even the movement of raw materials, clay, or wood for charcoal, suggests planning and cooperation. Clay suitable for sculpture may have come from specific river banks. Iron ore, often heavy, needed to be transported from its source to the smelting site. Such activities required shared effort, trust, and the balancing of communal and individual need. This quiet economy, without coin or contract, was rich in another kind of wealth, continuity. It allowed the Nok to thrive for centuries, not by conquest or central rule, but by connection, woven through trade, sustained by memory, and shaped by the steady hands of a people who understood that value lives not only in what one holds, but in what one gives. Every civilization, no matter how enduring, faces its dusk. For the Nok, that twilight came not with fire or conquest, but with silence, a gradual fading from the landscape, a quiet withdrawal into mystery. By the 1st century AD, traces of Nok life began to diminish. The terracotta figures, once abundant, became rare. Iron smelting sites fell cold. Pottery styles changed or disappeared altogether. The land that once pulsed with activity grew still. Why this happened remains uncertain. There is no clear event, no invader's account, no inscription of collapse. Instead, there are only traces, abandoned settlements, buried kilns, broken fragments beneath layers of later soil. The end of Nok was not abrupt. It was a long exhale. One possibility is environmental change. The savanna landscape, always delicate, may have shifted. Cycles of drought, erosion, or soil exhaustion could have made farming harder. Without stable crops, communities may have dispersed, searching for more fertile ground or returning to more mobile ways of life. Another possibility lies in the pressures of growth. As populations expanded, the resources required to sustain Nok life, clay for pots, wood for charcoal, ore for iron, may have become strained. Forests, if over-harvested, would have made iron smelting difficult. Depletion of local resources often precedes cultural transition. There may also have been internal shifts. Social changes, new beliefs, new leadership structures, new technologies might have led to a transformation in how people lived, crafted, and worshipped. The decline of terracotta production, for example, might not signal disappearance, but change, a move to different materials, different expressions, different customs. Finally, contact with other cultures, traders, migrants, neighboring peoples, could have brought new ideas, goods, and pressures. Cultural blending might have slowly erased distinct Nok traditions, replacing them with hybrid forms that left fewer marks in the archaeological record. What remains clear is that by around 200 AD, the world of Nok, as it had been, was gone. The sculptures no longer stood. The furnaces cooled. The songs and stories, once passed from voice to voice, fell quiet. Yet the Nok did not vanish entirely. Their descendants, whoever they were, carried forward echoes of their knowledge. Their land remained occupied. Their clay, though silent, still held memory. And in time, their legacy would rise again, not in new figures, but in the rediscovery of the old. When miners stumbled upon the first terracotta head in the 20th century, they uncovered not only a lost art, but a lost people. And with that discovery, the Nok were born again, not as a living culture, but as a remembered one. Not in power, but in presence. They remind us that not all decline is defeat. Sometimes, a culture leaves quietly, its gifts buried, waiting for hands to lift them into light once more. When a culture vanishes without a written word, its lineage becomes a question of echoes. Who were the Nok, truly? And who came after them? These are questions that do not yield simple answers, but invite us to listen closely, to names, to practices, to places where memory might still reside. The Nok left no direct inscriptions of identity. No list of kings, no genealogies carved in stone. But they left behind their works, their terracottas, their tools, their quiet architecture, and in these, hints of who they were and who they became. Some scholars suggest that the Nok were the ancestors of later peoples in central Nigeria, particularly the Jukuan, the Tarik, the Ron, and the Beram. These ethnic groups today inhabit regions not far from ancient Nok sites, and some of their oral traditions speak of long settlement and deep roots in the plateau. Whether these ties are biological, cultural, or spiritual is difficult to determine, but they offer continuity, a line of descent not through names, but through place. Among the Yoruba, farther southwest, the legacy is less direct, but still suggestive. The Yoruba artistic traditions, especially in Ifano, reveal a level of sculptural refinement that some see as a distant continuation of Nok's early achievements. The transition from terracotta to bronze, from abstraction to naturalism, may represent not a break, but a journey, a path through centuries of remembered form. The Igbo, too, have long traditions of metalwork and symbolic pottery. Sites like Igbo-Ukwu show advanced metallurgy and ritual use of objects that echo the functional beauty of Nok creations. These are not descendants in the bloodline sense, but inheritors of a visual and material language that began long before. What complicates the search for descendants is time. Nearly 1,000 years passed between the last Nok figures and the rise of new kingdoms in West Africa. In that time, people moved, languages changed, beliefs evolved. Cultures rose and fell, some leaving records, others vanishing in the winds of history. But identity is not only held in unbroken lineage. It is also held in soil, in memory, in the resonance of shapes and rituals. A hairstyle in a Nok terracotta may still be seen in the braids of a Beram elder. A gesture carved in clay may echo in the dance of a Jukuan ceremony. A forge once used to shape iron may still stand as sacred ground, though its builders are no longer named. And perhaps that is the truest form of descent, not in names, but in presence. In the way the land still holds them. In the way people still speak of ancestors, of spirits, of clay that remembers. The Nok live on, not as a single people, but as a quiet foundation. their identity did not end. It dispersed, it changed, it hid itself in new forms. And in that dispersal, they became not lost, but many. In the quiet hills of central Nigeria, where the Nok once shaped clay with patience and vision, another kind of shaping began, one not of creation, but of extraction. In the 20th century, as word spread of strange terracotta heads unearthed in tin mines, the long-buried culture of Nok began to rise again. But this rebirth came not through reverence, but through trade. And with it came loss. Looters, driven by profit and aided by demand from collectors and dealers across the world, began to tear into Nok sites. Armed not with tools of science but with shovels and haste, they unearthed thousands of fragments, heads, torsos, limbs, separating them from their soil, their context, and their meaning. What emerged from these illegal excavations was visually stunning, but historically wounded. Without knowing the exact place where a figure was found, without seeing its relation to pottery, tools, hearths, or burial sites, archaeologists lost the ability to understand its purpose. Was it part of a shrine? Was it placed beside a grave? Was it broken by time, or by ritual? These questions now hang unanswered. The looted figures entered private collections, museums, auction houses. Some were sold openly in European galleries. Others changed hands in silence, their origin stories fabricated or forgotten. Today, dozens, perhaps hundreds, of Nok sculptures sit in institutions far from the land that shaped them. And so the Nok, who once spoke through clay, were silenced again, this time not by time, but by commerce. The damage runs deeper than loss of objects. Looting disrupts the very ground from which knowledge grows. It destroys layers of soil, removes artifacts from their surroundings, and erases the delicate connections that allow historians to understand not just what was made, but why, how, and for whom. Efforts to stop this destruction have grown over time. Nigeria has passed laws against export of antiquities and has called for the return of stolen heritage. Some museums have responded. Others remain silent, their Nok pieces displayed without context, admired but unrooted. Yet not all is lost. A growing number of Nigerian scholars, archaeologists, and cultural stewards are reclaiming the Nok story, not only by calling for repatriation, but by conducting careful, respectful research. New excavations, done with patience and integrity, are revealing what looters could not, the deeper layers of Nok life, the meaning behind the figures, the quiet rhythm of a people who shaped more than just clay. And so, the story of Nok is still being written, not only in soil, but in struggle. The fight to preserve what remains, to recover what was taken, is part of that story now. For heritage is not just about the past. It is about justice. About remembering rightly. About returning voice to those who once spoke with fire and earth. The rediscovery of the Nok was not an accident, it was a slow awakening, led by careful minds and curious eyes, beginning in the mid-20th century and continuing into the present. Though looters uncovered the first figures, it was archaeologists who began the quiet work of understanding them, not as artifacts, but as echoes of a forgotten people. The first name forever linked with Nok archaeology is that of Bernard Fagg, a British archaeologist and colonial officer who, in the 1940s and 1950s, began systematic studies of the strange terracottas unearthed during tin mining operations. It was Fagg who identified Nok as something new, something ancient, something that demanded attention. With the help of local Nigerians, he excavated sites around Nok village and beyond, collecting and documenting what others had merely traded. Fagg's work laid the foundation. He mapped settlements, catalogued figures, studied kill remains, and preserved what he could. He was among the first to suggest that these figures represented a previously unknown Iron Age culture, one that had mastered not only metallurgy but symbolic art. His publications brought the Nok to the world's attention and made the case for West Africa's place in early world civilization. But even Fagg's work, for all its value, was constrained by its time. His team lacked the advanced tools of modern archaeology, radiocarbon dating, soil chemistry, and geophysical surveys. Moreover, much of his work was conducted under colonial authority, which often framed African history through a European lens. In the decades that followed, Nigerian archaeologists took the lead. As independence came and universities grew, a new generation of scholars emerged, men and women determined to reclaim the Nok story for themselves. They continued excavations at key sites like Taruga, Samandukia, and Katsinyala, refining dating methods, uncovering smelting areas, and deepening the understanding of Nok's social fabric. Among the most significant discoveries was confirmation of early iron smelting, evidence that the Nok independently developed metallurgical techniques without influence from northern or eastern civilizations. This finding challenged older theories that assumed African technological development was derivative. Nok, it turned out, was original. In recent years, international collaborations have helped bring new technologies to bear. Thermoluminescence and radiocarbon dating have provided more accurate timelines. Chemical analysis of clay and slag has revealed trade patterns and technological practices. Drones and ground-penetrating radar are beginning to map sites that once would have taken years to survey. Yet for all these advances, Nok archaeology remains a fragile discipline. Looting continues. Funding is limited. Political instability and environmental pressures make long-term work difficult. And much remains unexcavated, hidden beneath trees, villages, or roads. Still, the work goes on. Nigerian institutions, such as the National Commission for Museums and Monuments, and departments in universities across the country, are training new scholars, preserving finds, and telling the Nok story with growing authority. Each shard recovered, each furnace mapped, each soil layer recorded adds another line to that story. It is not merely about the past, it is about presence, about reclaiming what was buried, not only in earth, but in memory. And so, through dust and patience, the Nok rise again, not in silence, but in study. The Nok culture, for all its beauty and importance, remains shrouded in mystery. And where mystery lingers, so too do questions, many of them debated among scholars, each seeking to bring clarity to a story still half buried in the soil. One of the most enduring debates concerns the nature of the Nok itself. Was it a single, unified culture, cohesive across time and region, or was it a shared artistic tradition spanning many distinct communities, each with its own language, leadership, and identity? The archaeological evidence is both rich and elusive. Across the Nok region, similar terracotta styles appear, from the village of Nok to Taruga, Samandukia, and beyond. The facial features, body proportions, and decorative motifs are consistent enough to suggest a common visual language. Yet there are also differences, subtle variations in form, size, and technique that hint at regional identities. Were these artistic choices personal, tribal, or temporal? No one can say for certain. Some scholars propose that Nok culture is not the name of a people, but of an aesthetic, a way of seeing and shaping the world that was adopted by various groups over time. According to this view, what unites Nok sites is not governance or ethnicity, but shared symbolic traditions, passed through trade, marriage, and migration. Others argue for a more cohesive identity, a single cultural group with decentralized settlements, bound by language, belief, and mutual recognition. A second area of debate concerns the function of the terracotta figures. Were they sacred, didactic, commemorative, or decorative? Some figures suggest ritual use, guardians, ancestors, or spirits. Others may have been teaching tools, depictions of status, illness, or myth. A few might have served as grave goods or ceremonial offerings. Without written records or clear context, interpretations vary widely. And yet, the deliberate nature of their creation and placement suggests that meaning was never far from form. The origins of Nok ironworking also spark disagreement. Some researchers argue that the Nok developed iron smelting independently, a bold and sophisticated leap from stone tools to metallurgy without the intermediary step of copper or bronze. Others suggest that iron knowledge may have filtered southward from North Africa or across the Sahel via long-distance contact, adapting to local contexts along the way. The evidence from Taruga supports early, independent smelting, but the broader picture remains incomplete. Even the end of the Nok era invites speculation. Was it environmental change, resource depletion, cultural assimilation, or something else entirely that led to their decline? Some argue that Nok traditions were not lost but transformed, absorbed into the practices of later societies whose continuity is difficult to trace in material terms. These debates are not signs of confusion, but of richness. The Nok invite questions because they resist simple answers. They stand at the threshold of African prehistory and history, a culture sophisticated yet unwritten, creative yet quiet, enduring yet elusive. And so scholars continue to listen, to the soil, to the fragments, to the silent witnesses of a world long gone. Each debate, each theory, each excavation is a reminder that history is not only about what we know, but how we come to know it. The Nok do not offer final statements. They offer possibilities. To know when the Nok lived is to draw back a curtain of time and glimpse a world where centuries moved without calendar or clock. Yet archaeology, with its careful layers and precise methods, has begun to measure what the Nok themselves left unwritten. The dating of Nok culture has long been a subject of study, and of some uncertainty. Early discoveries, such as those at the village of Nok itself, hinted at great age, but lacked the tools to prove it. It was not until the mid-20th century, with the introduction of radiocarbon dating and later thermoluminescence techniques, that a more accurate picture began to form. Today, the consensus places the earliest phases of Nok culture around 1500 BCE, perhaps even earlier. At sites like Saman-Dukia and Taruga, charcoal samples from smelting furnaces and organic material found near pottery and terracotta figures have returned dates as old as 1500 to 1200 BCE. This makes Nok one of the earliest known Iron Age societies in sub-Saharan Africa. Their culture, however, did not rise and fall quickly. It endured. Evidence suggests a long lifespan, stretching over a millennium. The middle phase, approximately 1000 to 500 BCE, shows the height of Nok terracotta production and iron smelting. During this time, their artistic and technological achievements reached a maturity that would not be matched again in the region for centuries. The later phase, roughly 500 BCE to 200 CE, shows a gradual decline in both artistic complexity and the number of inhabited sites. Pottery becomes more utilitarian, terracotta figures become fewer and simpler, and iron smelting activity diminishes. Whether this was due to environmental pressures, social shifts, or other factors remains uncertain. What complicates the dating further is the pattern of discovery. Many Nok artifacts were removed from their original contexts by looters or by early, unrecorded mining activity. Without precise stratigraphy, knowing exactly where and how an item was buried, archaeologists can only date the surrounding soil or compare styles. Much valuable knowledge has been lost in this way. Even the end of Nok culture resists a firm date. Most scholars place its disappearance around the 2nd or 3rd century CE, but some suggest that pockets of Nok tradition may have persisted, unrecognized, into later regional cultures. The transition was not sudden, and the land did not empty. What faded was not the people, but the pattern, the way of shaping, the way of remembering, the way of marking time in clay. Thus, the timeline of Nok is both clear and soft-edged, a beginning around 1500 BCE, a flourishing through the first millennium, and a slow quieting by 200 CE. It spans the same centuries during which great changes unfolded elsewhere in the world, while Egypt rose and fell, while Greece wrote and fought, while Rome built and ruled. Yet in central Nigeria, the Nok were shaping their legacy without empires, without conquest, in a language of earth and fire. Their time was long. And though the clock no longer ticks for them, the marks they left are still counted, in dates, in layers, in the long memory of the land. To understand the Nok people is to understand the land that shaped them, its gifts, its burdens, its shifting moods over centuries. For though culture is made by human hands, it grows from soil, from sky, from the patient or volatile rhythm of the natural world. The Nok heartland, central Nigeria's Jos Plateau and the surrounding lowlands, offered much. The land was fertile, the rivers flowed, the air, though sometimes dry, carried the promise of rain. The region rested in a transition zone between forest and savanna, a crossroads of ecology as much as of people. It was this balance, between water and sun, field and forest, that nourished Nok life for generations. Yet the environment was never still. Throughout the first millennium BCE, Africa experienced fluctuations in climate. The Sahara, once greener in the deep past, continued its long march southward, pressing the margins of habitability. rainfall in West Africa became less predictable. Some years the rivers swelled, other years they dwindled. Droughts, if prolonged, would have strained agriculture, reduced crop yields, and forced new patterns of movement. The forests, once a source of wood for charcoal and shelter, may have receded under the pressure of population growth and iron smelting. The production of iron required vast amounts of fuel, trees cut, dried, burned into charcoal. As demand grew, forests thinned, erosion worsened, and soil fertility declined. The balance that once sustained Nok life grew fragile. There is evidence that some Nok sites were abandoned as the land around them changed. Settlements moved, perhaps following the rivers, perhaps seeking fresher soil. Others may have dwindled as the effort to maintain fields and forges outweighed their return. The clay used for pottery and sculpture, once abundant, may have become harder to find, or its sources overused. Environmental pressures do not erase cultures on their own. But they shift the foundation. They make old ways harder, less certain. And over time, they invite change, new strategies, new migrations, or new identities entirely. It is possible that the decline of the Nok was not a collapse, but a response, a long, adaptive turning toward other ways of life. Some communities may have moved into denser forests, others may have turned to pastoralism, still others may have joined or formed new cultural groups. What began as erosion became transition. Even today, the land remembers. The soil still hides furnaces. The rivers still flow past broken pots. The wind moves over forgotten mounds. And beneath it all lies the record of a people who listen closely to the earth, not as masters, but as stewards. For the Nok, the environment was never just background. It was partner, teacher, and, in the end, perhaps the gentle hand that drew the curtain closed. Among the many gifts the Nok left behind, clay figures, pattern pottery, fields once tilled, none shaped their world more profoundly than their mastery of iron. To smelt metal from stone without written instruction, without imported knowledge, was no small feat, it was a leap. A quiet revolution. And it stands today as one of the earliest known examples of technological innovation in sub-Saharan Africa. The process, as explored in earlier chapters, required more than heat. It demanded understanding of materials, of airflow, of timing. The Nok built furnaces from clay, created 2 years to inject air, produced charcoal to fuel the fires, and recognized the ore's worth breaking. They turned iron-bearing rocks into workable metal, then into tools that changed the way they planted, hunted, and built. What makes this achievement even more remarkable is that it seems to have arisen independently. Unlike Egypt, Mesopotamia, or Europe, where metallurgy evolved through copper and bronze before reaching iron, the Nok skipped those stages entirely. There is no evidence of bronze or even widespread copper use in the Nok record. Instead, they moved from stone directly to iron, without precedent, without intermediaries. This has led scholars to consider the possibility of an independent invention of iron smelting in West Africa. The Taruga site, with its well-dated furnaces and consistent slag patterns, supports this theory. Here, iron production was not experimental, it was organized. It was cultural. If true, This places the Nok among the pioneers of one of humanity's most transformative technologies. They were not borrowers of knowledge. They were originators. Their forges glowed with insight born from local experience, not foreign influence. But innovation for the Nok was not only about tools. It was also about art. The same clay that formed their furnaces formed their figures. The same fire that freed metal from ore hardened the terracotta that still watches us from across millennia. Their technology was not divided from their imagination. It was one continuous act of shaping, of world-making. There is elegance in this unity. Nok innovation was not a race toward complexity. It was a rhythm for slow, steady refinement of materials, of method, of meaning. They made what they needed, and what they believed in, with the same hands. And perhaps this is the lesson they offer us, not just that they knew how to smelt iron, but that they wove it into a life of balance, of beauty, of deep continuity. Their innovation was not conquest. It was craft. And in that craft, they changed their world. When we look at the Nok in the context of other ancient civilizations, those of the Nile, the Tigris-Euphrates, the Indus, or the Yellow River, we find no pyramids, no palaces, no empires bearing their name. And yet, in the quiet heart of West Africa, the Nok built something just as profound, a culture rooted in balance, in beauty, and in innovation. They lived during a time when other great centers of human development flourished. By 1000 BCE, Egypt had entered its third intermediate period. In Mesopotamia, Assyria, and Babylon competed for dominance. The Olmec thrived in Mesoamerica, and in China, the Zhou dynasty ruled a land rich in bronze and ritual. These were civilizations marked by writing, kingship, and monumental architecture. The Nok, by contrast, built no cities of stone. They left no written language. Their terracottas are their chronicles. Their furnaces are their libraries. Their settlements, scattered and modest, suggest a different kind of complexity, one not measured in conquest or construction, but in continuity and craft. Their mastery of iron, developed independently, places them alongside the earliest metallurgists in the world. This alone is a defining achievement. While Mesopotamian and Hittite smiths forged iron by the 2nd millennium BCE, their knowledge spread through conquest and trade. The Nok, seemingly isolated from these currents, reached similar ends through their own means. In art, the comparison is equally striking. The realism and elegance of Nok terracottas rival the portraiture of classical Greece or the sacred bronzes of Ife, which would appear a millennium later. Their stylized forms, expressive faces, and symbolic gestures speak of a deep aesthetic tradition. Unlike Egyptian statuary, which served royal and divine purposes, Nok figures seem more grounded, linked to ancestors, spirits, and the cycles of everyday life. Socially, the Nok resembled other early agrarian cultures. Like the Neolithic farmers of Europe or the village communities of the Indus periphery, they lived in extended households, practiced mixed farming, and developed specialized crafts. But what sets the Nok apart is the harmony of their world. There is no evidence of warfare, fortifications, or centralized control. Their complexity lay in networks, not hierarchies. In spiritual terms, their beliefs remain elusive, but the placement and posture of their figures suggest a culture deeply attuned to the unseen. Like the ritual sites of Neolithic Britain or the ancestor cults of early China, Nok's spiritual life may have revolved around memory, reverence, and the maintenance of balance between the living and the dead. Ultimately, comparisons enrich rather than diminish. The Nok remind us that civilization takes many forms. That greatness is not always loud. That cultural brilliance need not be carved into stone walls or spoken in royal decrees. Their legacy is quieter, but no less enduring. They show us a path of patience, of mastery without monument, of innovation without empire. They were not lesser. They were simply different. And in that difference, they shine. Long after the last Nok village fell silent, and their kilns cooled for the final time, the spirit of their art lived on, not in perfect replication, but in transformation. Like a seed carried by wind, the essence of Nok creativity took root elsewhere, growing into new forms, bearing new fruit. Across West Africa, the shaping of clay remained a sacred act. Potters, often women, continued to mold vessels for food, for water, for ritual. In their hands, the memory of Nok pottery survived, not in style alone, but in the care with which it was made, in the understanding that clay was more than utility. It was presence. It was tradition. But it was in sculpture, especially, that Nok's influence reached forward into time. In the forests of the southwest, the Yoruba developed an extraordinary artistic tradition centered in the city of Ife. By the 12th century CE, Ife sculptors were casting copper and bronze heads with a realism and refinement that astonished later generations. These heads, serene and balanced, echoed the calm dignity of Nok figures. Their attention to facial expression, to ornament, to symmetry, these were not coincidences. They were continuities. Further south, in the Kingdom of Benin, bronze casters produced reliefs and statues that told the story of royal lineage, divine ancestry, and cosmic order. Though different in material and scale, the Benin bronzes carried the same belief Nok had once shaped into clay, that the human figure could embody history, memory, and power. To the east, among the Igbo, terracotta figures and ritual vessels were crafted for shrines and ancestral altars. The people of Igbo Ukwu, with their advanced metalwork and symbolic art, seemed to carry forward the Nok principle that material could speak to the spirit, that form could hold the invisible. In the Sahel and Savannah, the Bura, the Jen, the Dogon, all produce sculptural traditions that, in their abstraction, gesture, and symbolism, bear faint but resonant echoes of Nok. In each, the human body is central, not as portrait, but as symbol, as bridge between the living and the beyond. This was not imitation. It was memory. It was a thread running across centuries, passed not in books or blueprints, but through craft, through practice, through the whispered teachings of the hand. Even today, in parts of Nigeria and West Africa, artisans work with terracotta. They shape clay for ritual, for remembrance, for beauty. Though they may not name Nok, they continue a conversation begun long ago, between earth and human, between past and present. In this continuity, we see the true legacy of Nok art. It was not a closed tradition. It was open, living, carried forward not by empire, but by touch. It did not end. It flowed. Through every figure shaped in silence, Nok art speaks still. The Nok left behind no written stories, no carved legends, no inked epics. But the absence of a script does not mean the absence of story. For memory, in the Nok world, may have lived not on pages, but in practice, in ritual, in gesture, in the form of clay shaped by knowing hands. And if we listen carefully to the traditions of later peoples in the region, the Beram, the Dukuan, the Tarak, the Yoruba, and others, we may catch faint echoes of the Nok world. Not literal tales of their rise and fall, but fragments of worldview, preserved in myth, in proverb, in the reverent silence of a sculptor before the earth. Among these communities, stories still speak of ancestors who dwell beneath the ground, who watch over the living, who must be remembered to preserve harmony. Shrines are built to them. Offerings are made. Clay figures, small and powerful, are placed at their feet. These are not the Nok reborn, but they may be the Nok remembered, transformed through time, retold through other tongues. In many West African myths, creation begins not with conquest, but with shaping, with the god who kneads the earth, who forms the first humans from clay, who breathes into them and sets them upon the land. These stories mirror what Nok artists did, shaping figures from red soil, giving form to what was unseen, what was sacred. Even the forge, so central to Nok life, carries mythic weight in later traditions. Among the Yoruba, Ogun is the deity of iron, of the smith, of transformation. He is feared and honored, for he governs both creation and destruction. In his fire lives both life and death. Was there, in Nok belief, such a spirit? We do not know. But the link between fire and the divine, between the smith and the sacred, likely has roots deeper than recorded history. The land itself may carry myth. Hills once occupied by Nok settlers are still known by names whose meanings are lost but whose weight remains. Rivers flow through places where figures were buried, where kilns once blazed. Local legends sometimes speak of ancient people, tall, wise, skilled, who vanished into the earth, or who walk still at night. Whether these are echoes of Nok or stories unto themselves, they remind us that memory often hides in landscape, in silence. What Nok believed, what stories they told around the fire, what names they gave the stars, we may never know. But they are not forgotten. Not entirely. For myth is not only what is spoken. It is what is felt when one sees a terracotta head with wide eyes, gazing across centuries. It is the silence that falls when the broken hands of a figure still seem to reach. It is the moment when a potter lifts clay and remembers that this earth, too, has memory. The Nok left us no mythologies carved in stone. They left form. And in that form, the story endures, not told, but seen. To piece together the history of a people who left no written record is an act of patience, of listening not to words, but to soil, to stone, to the silence between artifacts. The Nok are such a people. Their legacy is vivid in form, but fragile in detail. And every effort to reconstruct their world faces obstacles, some practical, others profound. First is the problem of context. So many Nok artifacts, especially the terracottas, were looted before archaeologists could study them in situ. Removed from the ground without notes, stripped of their surroundings, these figures arrive in museums and collections as orphans. Without knowing where or how they were buried, it becomes nearly impossible to understand their function. Were they part of a shrine? A grave? A household altar? The answers often die in the haste of excavation. Even when artifacts are found in proper context, their interpretation is limited by absence. There are no written descriptions, no oral histories tied directly to Nok times. The objects must speak for themselves, but their language is partial, suggestive, open to many readings. Dating, too, remains a challenge. Thermoluminescence and radiocarbon methods have improved our understanding, but they are imprecise when context is disturbed. A figure buried 1,000 years ago may have been made centuries earlier. A furnace may still contain wood charcoal, but was the charcoal used once, or many times? Such questions demand caution. Then there is the vastness of the region itself. Nok artifacts have been found across hundreds of kilometers, from Kaduna to Nasarawa, from the plateau to the river valleys. Yet the landscape is difficult. Sites are remote, often overgrown or now occupied. Political unrest, land use, and development have further restricted access. Many sites likely remain undiscovered, or have been destroyed before they could be studied. Add to this the global art market's insatiable appetite for Nok terracottas. The price of a single head, broken or whole, can reach millions. This demand fuels ongoing looting, making it hard for scholars to protect, let alone understand, what remains. Even within academia, challenges persist. Funding for archaeological work in Nigeria is limited. Institutions must do much with little. International collaboration has helped, but local expertise remains the cornerstone. And yet, many Nigerian archaeologists face barriers, lack of equipment, limited access to publishing, and the ongoing legacy of colonial-era narratives that shaped how African history was once studied and understood. Despite all this, progress continues. New generations of Nigerian researchers are leading fieldwork, reinterpreting finds, and demanding greater respect for their heritage. Technological advances, from drone surveys to chemical fingerprinting, offer new tools. Repatriation efforts are gaining momentum as stolen Nok pieces begin to return home. But the deeper challenge remains unchanged: how to rebuild a world from fragments. How to see the lives behind the clay. How to honor a culture that spoke not in words, but in form. This is not a task of certainty. It is a task of care. And in that care, the Nok are remembered, not perfectly, but truly. In the slow work of archaeology, the earth still surprises. Even after decades of study, the Nok continue to reveal themselves, one shard at a time, one layer deeper, one breath closer to a fuller picture. Recent discoveries, made by careful hands and guided by new technologies, have opened new doors into their world. In the last 2 decades, Nigerian archaeologists, often working in collaboration with international scholars, have returned to sites long known, but never fully understood. Places like Janjala, Interuji, and Pangwari have offered fresh insights, not only into the artistry of Nok culture, but into its daily life, settlement patterns, and long geographic reach. At Jandula, excavations revealed terracotta fragments in situ, buried precisely where they were placed or fell. This allowed researchers, for the first time in many years, to study the relationship between sculpture and environment. Were they part of ritual spaces? Boundary markers? Offerings? While answers remain elusive, the questions are now clearer and better grounded in evidence. Pangwari, a more recently explored site, has yielded stratified layers of occupation, offering glimpses of how Nok settlements may have shifted over time. Here, alongside terracotta and pottery, researchers found stone tools and signs of early iron production. These findings challenge the idea of a linear progression from stone to iron and suggest a period of overlap, of experimentation, of technological blending. Even the clay itself is being studied with new eyes. Petrographic analysis, microscopic study of clay minerals, has begun to reveal trade routes and clay sourcing patterns. By comparing the composition of different terracottas, researchers can now trace where the materials came from and how far certain figures may have traveled. This work suggests more movement, more exchange, more complexity than once imagined. In museums and private collections, technology is also peeling back layers. 3D scanning, residue analysis, and non-invasive imaging are helping scholars learn more about figures long removed from their original sites. Microscopic traces of pigment hint that some terracottas were once painted. Tool marks suggest methods of shaping and smoothing unknown until now. Perhaps most heartening is the growing role of Nigerian institutions in this work. Universities and museums across Nigeria are leading excavations, preserving artifacts, and training the next generation of scholars. Their work is not just scientific, it is cultural, reclaiming a history once fragmented by colonialism and trade. And yet, for all this progress, much remains hidden. Vast areas of Nok territory have never been surveyed. Entire settlement clusters may still lie beneath farmland or forest. The potential for discovery is enormous, but so too is the need for protection. Each new find carries weight, not only because it adds to the historical record, but because it honors a legacy. The Nok may have lived in silence, but they shaped their world with care. Every figure found, every furnace uncovered, every layer brushed free of dust, brings us closer to knowing not only what they made, but who they were. The earth still speaks, and the Nok still have more to say. The Nok culture, once buried in obscurity, now stands among the pillars of African archaeology, thanks not only to the artifacts unearthed, but to the minds that chose to listen to the soil, to trace the patterns, and to give voice to a silent past. Their legacy lives not only in clay, but in scholarship, in the long, patient work of understanding. The earliest efforts to study Nok came through the hands of Bernard Fagg, whose mid-20th century excavations laid the foundation for nearly all subsequent research. Fagg's work was pioneering, both in its scope and in its respect for African material culture. He recognized in Nok art a sophistication equal to that of any ancient civilization and pushed against prevailing colonial narratives that dismissed Africa's past as primitive or derivative. Fagg's interpretations, however, were bound by the limitations of his time, technologically and contextually. his focus was largely on art and material culture, and though invaluable, much of the deeper social, environmental, and technological aspects of Nok life remained unexplored. In the decades that followed, new voices emerged, especially from within Nigeria. Scholars such as Ekpo Eo, Joseph Ebrahim, and Peter Brunig, a German archaeologist who worked closely with Nigerian institutions, brought fresh eyes and methods to Nok research. Brunig, in particular, led extensive excavations in the early 2000s, applying modern dating techniques and broadening the focus to include settlement patterns, agriculture, and metallurgy. These newer studies shifted the narrative. Nok was no longer seen merely as an artistic culture, it was now understood as a complex society with social organization, environmental adaptation, and technological innovation. The emphasis moved from objects to systems, from sculpture to settlement, from figure to function. More recently, interdisciplinary research has further enriched our understanding. Soil scientists, chemists, and materials analysts have joined the effort, using tools such as X-ray fluorescence and isotope analysis to study trade, resource use, and craft production. The result is a more holistic picture of Nok life, one that connects art to labor, technology to ritual, land to lineage. Yet Nok studies remain a fragile field. Many artifacts are still in private hands, undocumented and unstudied. Looting continues, and funding is often scarce. International museums hold hundreds of Nok pieces, often without provenance, and access to these collections is not always granted to Nigerian scholars. At the same time, new energy is rising. Nigerian universities are training a new generation of archaeologists and cultural historians. Partnerships between Nigerian and international institutions are growing more equitable. The call for repatriation of looted artifacts has become louder, more insistent, and more morally urgent. In the pages of journals, in the halls of museums, in the classrooms of Zaria and Abuja, the Nok are being re-examined, recontextualized, and reintroduced, not as a lost people, but as part of a living heritage. Their story, once scattered in fragments, is being pieced together, not only by those who dig, but by those who remember. The story of Nok is not finished, not in the soil, not in the scholarship, and certainly not in the hearts of those who carry its memory forward. As we look to the future, the study of Nok culture stands at a crossroads, facing both challenges and immense potential. The most pressing need is preservation. Vast swaths of land where Nok once flourished remain unexcavated, vulnerable to development, looting, and environmental change. Without formal protection, sacred mounds may be leveled, artifacts scattered, and knowledge lost forever. Nigeria's cultural institutions, though deeply committed, often lack the resources to patrol and preserve these sites. Support, financial, legal, and logistical, is essential. Equally important is repatriation. Hundreds of Nok artifacts, many looted or exported illegally during the 20th century, remain in foreign collections. Their return is not merely symbolic. It is an act of restoration, of memory, of justice, of the right to self-narrate. When these figures come home, they do more than fill museum halls. They reconnect a people with their past. Yet the return of objects must be accompanied by the return of voice. The future of Nok studies lies in the hands of Nigerian scholars, curators, and communities. They are not only caretakers, they are interpreters, inheritors, and innovators. Their work, grounded in lived experience and cultural intimacy, brings nuance and depth that cannot be imported. To support this future, education is key. Investment in archaeological programs, local museums, and community heritage initiatives will ensure that the next generation is not only aware of the Nok but engaged in their legacy. Programs that link school children to nearby sites, or train villagers in site preservation, can transform abstract history into personal connection. Technological advancement will also shape what comes next. Remote sensing, satellite imagery, and AI-assisted analysis may reveal buried settlements and undiscovered regions of Nok activity. 3D modeling, virtual reconstructions, and digital archives can bring the Nok world to life for global audiences, while preserving delicate artifacts in virtual form. But beyond tools and texts, the heart of future Nok studies lies in a question both simple and profound: how do we remember? The Nok did not build empires. They built homes. They did not leave temples. They left figures in clay. Their memory endures not because of conquest, but because of care, care in craft, care in belief, care in how they touched the earth. And now it is our turn to care, to protect, to study, to teach, to remember. In doing so, we do not merely study the Nok. We continue them. The Nok culture, though long buried, has become more than a subject of archaeology. It has become a symbol. A symbol of origin, of dignity, and of a deep African past too long overlooked or dismissed. In the faces of their terracotta figures, many see not only ancient artisanship, but affirmation of African ingenuity, of African beauty, of African civilization. For centuries, narratives of Africa's history were shaped by outsiders, often colonial powers who framed the continent as a place without history, without achievement, without memory. In that frame, Africa was thought to have received civilization from elsewhere, from Egypt, from Islam, from Europe, never to have birthed it on its own. The Nok stand in quiet, graceful defiance of that view. They show that long before the rise of Western empires, long before the arrival of foreign scribes and soldiers, African peoples were building societies rooted in art, in metallurgy, in spiritual depth. They were not waiting for history. They were making it, in earth, in iron, in community. Today, as Africans and the African diaspora continue to reclaim and retell their histories, the Nok serve as a foundation. They remind the world, and themselves, that greatness does not begin with colonial encounter. It begins with place, with people, with time. Nok figures have become emblems in museums and textbooks, but also in consciousness. For many Nigerians, especially in the Middle Belt regions, the knowledge that their land once held such brilliance brings pride and responsibility. For African artists, the stylized elegance of Nok sculpture offers inspiration, a lineage to draw from, not as revival, but as continuation. In cultural policy and heritage education, Nok now plays a central role. Exhibitions, films, and school curricula increasingly place Nok at the beginning of the Nigerian story, not as a relic, but as a root. This shift changes how young people see themselves, not as inheritors of a borrowed legacy, but as descendants of a deep, creative past. In the wider African context, the Nok join other ancient civilizations, Mero, Gen, Aksum, Great Zimbabwe, as proof of the continent's internal complexity. Together, they form a tapestry of human achievement that stretches across deserts and forests, rivers and savannas. They are not isolated marvels. They are connected testaments to African continuity. But perhaps most importantly, the Nok remind us that identity is shaped not only by struggle, but by creation. Not only by resistance, but by remembrance. In their art, we see the echo of African hands shaping their world, not for the gaze of the outsider, but for their own eyes, their own gods, their own children. And in that shaping, identity was not claimed. It was lived. The Nok have long fallen silent. Their villages lie beneath the grass, their furnaces cold, their names forgotten by time. And yet, they endure. Not in words, not in empire, but in form, in gesture, in the quiet weight of their creation. A terracotta head gazes out with wide, pierced eyes, not fierce, but thoughtful. A posture of calm, of balance, as if listening to the world around it. These figures, made without haste, without tools of precision, still hold the essence of those who shaped them. They are not ruins. They are echoes. What remains of the Nok is not grand in scale, but deep in spirit. It tells us that civilization is not only cities and conquest. It can be found in the gentle shaping of clay, in the controlled burn of a smelter's fire, in the care with which one lays a figure in the earth. The Nok lived not in dominance, but in harmony, with one another, with their tools, with the land that sustained them. They knew the rhythms of rain and season. They worked with patience. They forged iron where none had done before. They sculpted what they could not write. And in doing so, they left a legacy that, though quiet, refuses to disappear. In their absence, we are reminded of presence. In their disappearance, we find reflection. They do not speak, yet they are not voiceless. Their art is their language. Their technology, their belief, their simple domestic order, all whisper of a world once whole. And so the story ends not with a fall, but with a return. The Nok rise again, not in power, but in memory. In every figure unearthed, in every soil layer studied, in every scholar's hand that lifts a shard from the earth, they return. Not lost. Simply waiting.